What are some of the dodgiest workplace practices you've ever witnessed? I worked for an online video game retailer, so there was a front office and a warehouse in the back. There were about 15 warehouse guys and about 7 office people. I bounced back and forth, but was mostly in the warehouse. The owner slash boss was a notorious cheapskate, among many, many other things. If he had an HR department, he'd have been fired 1,000 times. And that was never proven more than when our toilets broke. First one backed up, then the second did. The pipes burst and our parking lot was covered in raw sewage. What did my boss do? New policy. If you have to go to the bathroom, clock out and go to the Burger King a mile down the street. Most people there didn't have cars, so we had to organize group bathroom trips. We got yelled at if we took too long. When someone finally said something, he got furious. He said he didn't have the frickin' money to fix the toilet, so we had to deal with it. Eventually, enough people complained that he ordered 2 porta potties placed directly next to our workstations inside the warehouse. And we had a few guys that took atomic craps several times a day. So basically, our work area smelled like crap and we had to walk in crap when we left. After a few months, he got around to getting it fixed, and the following week, someone used paper towels to wipe their butt and immediately back the toilet up again. Rinse and repeat. Sheesh, you would think he would call OSHA or something about this, right? That can't be sanitary at the very least. Story 2. I work for the company which owns all those lying sponsored links that you see on torrent sites. Since they basically scam people into buying uTorrent and a reskinned version of LimeWire, they trained us on how to lie to people over the phone, only using specific words in the event that cops are on the other end of the line. It's the only job I've ever been fired from because I morally felt terrible trying to retain customers knowing they were scammed. Story 3. We never get pay stubs at the store where I work. Even if you get a physical check, there's hardly any information printed on it. You basically have to be a hawk and track all of your hours to double check that you aren't being underpaid. There was a pay period where they forgot to pay me for 49 hours. There's plenty of other questionable practices there too. For example, we get calls to the store all of the time about overdue bills that the owner basically ignores. One time, the power got shut off and she blamed the store manager even though he told her on a daily basis about the overdue bill. The owner is basically highly erratic. She screams, cries, and throws legitimate 2-year-old-like tantrums on a regular basis. She once destroyed the inside shelves of a mini fridge because they wouldn't fit the pictures she bought and then ran to the store window and started crying loudly. I recently put in my notice without having another job lined up because after 14 months or so, I just can't handle it anymore. I'm sure one day I'm going to see a New York Post headline that goes, "Business owner causes significant damage to own store." Story 4. As someone who worked in a university library, lots of theft. If you work there, you can manually type in that the book/CD/headphones are returned or they are MIA, missing in action, depending on your access. Or even worse, every time you swipe a student's ID to check something out, the screen shows their full name, student PIN code, and full address. Hypothetically, you could steal an item and then check it out to anyone on campus whose name you knew, giving them late fees until they can't get their grades at the end of the semester, left to run around campus wondering why it says they have these books out that they never got. There is no way for them to trace it back to you. All that's given at checkout is a checkout time. Story 5. In a supermarket where I used to work, there was a small elevator for moving stock from the ground floor up to the first floor. The stock room was 2 stories. There was a small door on the side of it, about 1 by 1 meter, that you could squeeze through if the lift got stuck, which happened maybe once or twice a week. When you climbed into this opening, there was a gap of about half a meter between the wall and the lift that some people could just about fit through. Here, you could climb up on top of the lift and move the obstruction that was causing the lift to stop. We had one small guy that would jump in and fix it anytime it got stuck. The only problem is that there were no overrides, and if someone was on the upper floor and called the lift, the person inside would potentially be severely injured. I always cringed and made my way up to the upper floor to ward off any coworkers whenever I saw this happening. Story 6. I worked at a fast food joint in high school. Nearly everyone I worked with sold illegal substances, so we'd constantly have customers coming in and just asking for a certain person. Then they would conduct transactions at the front counter with no attempt to hide what was going on. Haha. My manager also liked to use substances in her car and then come in visibly impaired, occasionally stumbling in front of the customers. We also observed her engaging in inappropriate activity with a man in the parking lot and in the walk-in freezer. Tons of other wild things I can't remember. Story 7. I worked for a company called Sutherland Global in the Department of AT&T Customer Care. One of the managers reportedly made unwanted advances toward an employee, creating a deeply distressing situation for her. She was understandably upset and pressed charges. The manager was taken into custody and later released on bail. Sutherland didn't fire him. They transferred him to another department under AT&T with a promotion and pay increase so that the poor girl didn't have to interact with him anymore. She's still in the same position and reportedly receives threatening text messages regularly that no one bothers to address. Story 8. I worked at a Harley-Davidson dealership in Central Texas. If one customer's bike needed a part and they didn't have it in stock, they'd take it off of another customer's bike. The second bike would get the new part when it finally came in. If your bike was in for an oil change and tires, you might get it back with a different cylinder head, ignition system, or transmission. Story 9. In my previous department, the professor who had taught his first year intro physics was deemed cute by many girls in his class, and he showed a preference for Asian girls. He seemed to always have a few in his office and was such close friends with one that he wrote homework problems for his class about her running towards a shoe sale and such. He was also a mentor in some nearby high school, and from what I heard, he pursued a relationship with the girl right after she turned at the legal age. This girl later put photos of this man in her yearbook ad, all very common knowledge stuff, but everyone turned a blind eye. This department also had a professor who taught several classes and said in a faculty meeting that the grades in his classes had been going down ever since more women started taking them, and no one said anything to contradict or discipline him. So yeah, there's a reason I got out of there. Story 10. I used to work for a Pizza Hut. Inspectors would come by every month or so to make sure everything was up to standard. The chief manager/owner would pride himself on how he always passed the inspections by keeping all the ingredients fresh. He was absolutely focused on keeping up appearances, and literally whenever there was any downtime at all, he would make us wipe everything down, mop the floor, wash our hands, etc. Obviously, there were no breaks, and he wouldn't even let us drink free water from the refill machine. You want to know how he kept all the ingredients quote-unquote fresh? All toppings and prep pizza templates, cinnamon buns, pizza rollers, sauce have to have stickers on them saying when they were prepared and when they need to be thrown out. This time span is usually from open to close for most ingredients. In the 2 months I worked there, I never saw anything thrown out. We replaced the labels 100% on time though. Story 11. I work in a lab, and on the second day we had a safety seminar. Since I was a new person, I was the subject of all the demonstrations. Being new and forced to stand in place while the instructor showed areas to avoid touching was pretty uncomfortable. One of the demonstrations was about socializing while holding chemicals. The instructor held an open bottle of liquid while telling us not to gesture. While demonstrating how not to gesture, he gestured all over me, and I was subsequently forced to use the chemical shower. I was the person the instructor demonstrated on, but me being up there wasn't mandatory. He asked me to be up there in a teasing sort of way, although I'll admit that his suggestion was pretty forceful, which I agreed to. I wanted to be a part of the team since it was a new job, and I didn't want to give off the impression that I wasn't a team player or too embarrassed to have fun with everyone else. The seminar was uncomfortable for me in particular, but no inappropriate physical touching occurred. He did grab my shoulders and direct me into all kinds of poses and move his hands around my body while demonstrating what areas to avoid touching on my body. At least I had clothes on. Rather, the dodgiest part was when he spilled the liquid on me and I had to take off my clothes and stand in the chemical shower in front of all my new coworkers. I don't know what the substance was. It could have been water for all I know, or it could have been another substance. If they really were as irresponsible as to spill real chemicals on someone during a safety demonstration, or if it was a very strange and inappropriate prank on the new guy, they did take safety seriously. It took less than 5 seconds before I was standing in the lab safety shower. Story 12. I worked at this restaurant a few years ago that didn't really try that hard to live up to the standards of good hygiene as outlined by the New York City Department of Health. When I first started working there, sure, it was an old building, and yeah, you've got to expect to put up with a certain amount of filth as a New York City resident, but some corners of the place represented more of an insect sanctuary than an actual establishment where people paid money to be served food. But whatever, the money was decent enough that I was able to put the grossness out of my mind somewhat, and there were perks to working there like free ice cream, free soda. I love drinking free soda from a soda fountain. I've always wanted my own personal soda fountain ever since I was a freshman in high school on the first day of class. I had this history teacher that told us there were a few water fountains located throughout the building that dispensed Arizona iced tea or Coca-Cola instead of water, and being the naive and gullible kid that I was, I bought the lie completely. When I eventually found out that I had been fooled, I could never shake that insatiable thirst for an unlimited amount of free soft drinks. And even though I've yet to meet anybody with their own personal soda fountain, working at this restaurant was the closest that I'd ever come to having that dream realized. Regardless of the bad moods of certain customers or how crazy the kitchen became during an especially chaotic dinner service, I'd always be able to sneak in 10 seconds or so to fill up a Dixie cup with a mouthful of Mountain Dew or root beer or orange soda. I never touched Pepsi, not even once. I'm a Coke man through and through. That's all I ever needed, really, not a whole serving, just enough for a satisfying mouthful. And that's the problem with bottled soda. You have to drink the whole thing in one reasonably timed sitting. Unless you have access to your own soda fountain, of course, you're not able to really get just a sip of soda with the perfect amount of carbonation at just the right temperature whenever you feel like it. But after a few weeks, people started looking at me funny every time I went in for a drink. Don't you guys like soda? I'd ask nobody in particular, wondering if my coworkers were super health conscious or maybe diabetic. I just couldn't figure out why, apart from serving it to the guests, I was the only one making any use of our soda fountain. Finally, one day, another waiter pulled me aside. He said, "Hey Rob, you must really like soda." And I said, "Of course I like soda. Who doesn't?" But he continued, "No, it's just that you must really, really like soda to be drinking so much out of that machine. Don't you ever think about why nobody else touches it?" And yeah, like I had already said, I did wonder why nobody else was indulging in what I considered one of the only benefits of being a full-time waiter at a pretty mediocre Manhattan tourist trap. I just figured that, I don't know, you guys are all watching your weight. Please, he went on, and you never noticed the busboys dumping all of that bleach down the drain in the morning? Yeah, now that he mentioned it, I guess I was at least partially aware of the bleach, but up until that moment, I'd never questioned it. They put the bleach down because the pipes are all moldy and clogged up, but they won't pay anyone to replace the system. You ever catch a whiff of that barnacle smell when the ice bucket gets low? But it got worse. Come here. He brought me over to my precious, precious soda fountain and winced as he lifted up the cover behind the 7-Up label. Right underneath the surface of what looked like such an inviting piece of machinery was one of the grossest things I'd ever seen, a massive, dense congregation of insects that quickly scattered upon being exposed to the light. The syrup leaks. This machine is broken. There are insects everywhere. And yeah, that did it for me. I'm sure that most of the other restaurants and fast food places have to have better standards of cleanliness, but I'm not going to lie, it's still a little hard to drink fountain soda. It's one of my all-time happiest pleasures that's been irrevocably ruined by that one motion, my coworker lifting back the curtain to reveal the disgusting innards of a poorly kept up soda machine. What a dump. Story 13. Biotech guy here. I am so glad I can vent about the disaster that is my workplace. People throwing each other under the bus constantly. I mean, zero accountability when it comes to scientific staff. Everything becomes the blame game. To make it worse, there is no formalized training, so no one is trained in anything. And then when a mistake happens, it's automatically your fault. Boss has his girlfriend who has zero industry experience as a paid employee. I think I saw her at an employee lunch once. She does nothing and gets a nice salary. Said boss, before his current girlfriend, when married, often engaged in inappropriate relationships with others and even showed fellow employees text messages about those interactions. His wife is also part owner of the company. Photos of the boss's girlfriends were reportedly circulating in the office. He expenses out anything as a business expense even when it's not. Stupidity on a massive, contagious scale. And that's all I can muster right now. Story 14. A company I worked for that went into liquidation was tasked and paid to dispose of greenhouse gases correctly from the fridges we fetched back after delivering new ones. These were not normal fridges, but food display units, mortuary cold rooms, and the like. I don't know exactly how it worked, but they were supposed to use a machine that sucked out the gas and put it into a new cylinder where it would be disposed of correctly. However, I once caught the foreman smashing the copper pipes with hammers in order to discharge the gases into the atmosphere. The same company also had a habit of allowing the guards for guillotines, large metal cutters that could cause severe injury and happily chew through 5mm steel all day, to be taken off. Furthermore, any other tool that could be operated without a guard was permitted if it made work easier, prioritizing speed over safety. Story 15. I currently work at a Chinese buffet, and honestly, I have no idea how the health inspector hasn't shut them down. The dishwashers never change the water in their sink. It gets disgusting after 1 to 2 hours. They don't actually wash the cups, they just rinse them with water. They wash silverware with Windex. The worst, though, is the way they store food. They leave meat out overnight, both cooked and raw. They leave cooked stuff out to put in the fridge in the morning, and they leave the raw stuff out to thaw and cool the next day. Half the time it's not even frozen anyways. Story 16. Worked for a cell phone reseller in 2006 to 2009 at one of those small kiosks at the local crappy mall. The owner instructed us that the required credit check application should just be forgone and ignored, just sell everyone a phone plan no matter what. He regularly told us to forge signatures, accidentally include expensive insurance plans that did basically nothing, and to exploit people that spoke little English and the elderly. This went on for months. He paid pretty well, but I eventually felt terrible about what we were doing. Any repercussions from any questionable deal that was made didn't matter. He cared about how the end sales figures looked to our home office. I quit. He got arrested for fraud. The kiosk is still used for cell phone sales, but a totally different company. Story 17. I was working construction right out of college. We were tearing down a crane system inside an old warehouse. One of my foremen was operating a large skyjack, and I was picking up scraps of track from the crane and throwing it out. There was probably a 2-foot-long bracket made of stainless steel that another worker was trying to get free but was having trouble, couldn't loosen the stripped screw holding the bracket to the beam. So my foreman went over and tried to pop it free using the tire of his skyjack by positioning the tire directly next to the bracket and rotating the tire. The bracket was maybe 3 feet off the ground on a freestanding pillar. I was picking stuff up about 50 feet away while this was happening. Well, the skyjack tire pried the bracket free and sent it shooting across the warehouse like it was shot out of a gun. I heard it whiz through the air and felt it just catch a loose part of my jeans. I was looking at the other direction at the wall the bracket hit. That thing traveled at least 150 feet through the air and didn't have a gravity drop of more than 6 inches. It was moving fast. I looked at my leg where I had felt the bracket whiz by and there was a 1-inch tear in my jeans. I looked back at my foreman who was staring in horror, thinking he had just caused me a severe injury with his carelessness. If it had been another couple inches to the right, he would have. Story 18. I worked for a temp agency and they sent me to a place they said made the mix for McFlurries. I was stationed on a platform 20 feet or so up. They had me empty bags of flour, sugar, and chocolate peanut butter bars into a big grinder with fast-spinning metal blades. It would travel down a chute and go somewhere. There was a safety bar so no one would fall over. Well, instead of having a stepladder or some other sturdy structure to stand on, I was stationed on a stack, 7, of wobbly pallets above the safety bar. If I slipped, I could have been severely injured by the machinery. On top of that, there were no sanitary procedures. I don't have to wash up before handling the food and no gloves were provided. After 40 minutes of it, I left the job immediately. Story 19. Not witnessed, but pretty much anything I did while I was in Haiti drilling water wells. I was running a 16,000-pound drill rig with no safety gear at all, pretty much just some pants and a t-shirt. No shoes, gloves, hard hat, glasses, earplugs, everything that is required by OSHA back in the States. It was regularly around 100 degrees Fahrenheit and there was no way I was wearing all that required gear. If anything broke on that drill rig, I was facing a severe risk of injury anyway, so there was no point in safety gear, plus I was about 5 hours away from any real kind of health care. The only option was a 5-hour helicopter ride to Miami, not including time for the helicopter to fly down there. The fact I was under the influence of alcohol about 90% of the time didn't help either. And if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 20. To be honest, you could almost do my entire job by fashioning a simple random number generator in Excel. The clients change their minds on results so often we might as well make everything up. I run statistical analysis for water companies on their leakage levels to help them obtain an economical level of leakage through recommendations of repair numbers and types on leaks detected by the client or by the public, aka Tom at X house spotting a fountain in the road. There's a lot of analysis and formulas used, all dependent on the client's own specific figures such as main lengths, population counts, night use allowance, mains pressure, etc. The problem is, and every company does this, once we give them the results, they always say, can you reduce these figures? And we basically nudge some figures for them. It just takes forever for them to make their minds up about what figures to use. Once they do settle on a figure, they present their results, done by us, to UKWIR, the UK water governing body, so they can check the report and methodology and say, this is unquestionable, and sign it off with requirements for the next financial year, usually just lower leakage when you boil it all down. So they come back to us if we're priced right, and around we go. What's funny and makes the random number generator kick in is because the options are so vast for the client, they never actually see the formulas we use. We follow and made most of the best practice selected by UKWR, so our method is available to all, but our technique to obtain said method isn't. The amount of stuff I could just change manually or have a random number be picked staggers me every time. I ultimately affect people's water bill prices though, so great power, great responsibility or whatever. Story 21. I volunteered at a summer camp for children affected by HIV this past summer for a few days, a camp where most of the campers were inner-city kids with very little experience outdoors. On the second day, everyone heads down to the waterfront to swim and I go down to lifeguard. Leaving the director to organize the kids was a big mistake. Did she send a few in at a time, check if they could swim, count how many were in the water? No, no, and no. About 75 children go running into the water regardless of ability. Luckily, nothing went wrong, but the director refused to adjust her methods. I got out of that place quickly before any liability could be put on me. Story 22. I worked for an insulation company making it out of recycled paper. I was asked to clean the vents and went up like I was asked. After 3 hours of being in there, I was informed by a long-term worker that I shouldn't have gone in without an oxygen supply and a full biohazard suit due to fine particles. That, and I was smoking, just finishing my break when the boss asked. He told me to keep smoking and just go up and do it. Me, being the smart cookie, thought it common sense to put out my cigarette before climbing a 20-meter tall tower and opening a container swirling with microscopic bits of paper. After all was said and done, I asked my boss who my union rep was. Heh, guess who? I also asked who my state rep was. Yeah, unlucky, I guess. Story 23. I used to work for the Humane Society in town as an education director. One of my jobs was to take animals that were struggling to get adopted on the local news and promote them. These would always be older dogs, pit bulls, black labs, or cross-eyed cats. Getting them on TV and telling a sympathy story would always get people to rush in and adopt them that day. However, what many people don't know is it's very difficult financially to run an animal shelter off of just stray animals. We ended up taking part in this program called PetSmart Rescue Wagon, where we get truckloads of puppies in from overrun shelters in the South so that they could get them adopted out and raise our funds. Granted, this program did save a lot of lives, but we got so many puppies. And people love puppies, so if they see an 8-year-old frowning lab next to a cage of happy, playful puppies, they will take 2 or 3 puppies home and forget about the sad dog. Anyways, we began adopting out so many puppies from this program that we started asking for more from the program. Only we ran out of room at the shelter, so we started euthanizing dogs that were unlikely to get adopted, basically the ones I took on the news. Also, we could get more puppies, and we would then say that we euthanized the animal for a behavior issue or health issue when there really was nothing wrong with them. In order to take part in the puppy program, you have to not euthanize any animals for space, so we flat out lied. The last straw was when I took this pit bull on the news, Rosie, who was so sweet and happy. I brought her back to the shelter from the 12 o'clock news, and my boss literally took her leash right from me and said we had to euthanize her because we were getting more puppies from Rescue Wagon that night and had to make room. I felt so sick and got into an argument with my boss, I couldn't believe it. I ended up leaving that job within a week. Story 24. It's not dodgy as much as unfair, but I once worked at this shop where they always got you to work overtime by just never letting you leave. It would come to the end of the day and everyone just carried on working like a drone for hours. They didn't ask you to stay, it just happened. Of course, in any shop you expect to stay behind for an hour or so to clean, restock, cash up, etc. But I'm talking 5 to 7 hours after the end of your shift, and during that time you would not be allowed to get your phone to tell your family you would be late, cancel your taxi, etc. You just had to keep going with no end in sight. On my first day, my family thought I'd been worried about on the way home. Sometimes I worked 9 a.m. to 2 a.m. with only one break for lunch in the middle of the day. I wasn't even allowed to use the toilet. It was completely against employment laws in the UK, and despite constantly being over my contracted hours and over the 48-hour working limit, I never once got paid overtime. The staff definitely enabled this as much as the managers enforced it, and newbies just had to go along with it all. Story 25. I was working for a contractor over the summer as a student. They needed cheap labor. I could swing a sledgehammer and didn't know the difference between a labor unit and a Labrador retriever, so I was their man. One day, we're taking down some water piping above a drop-down ceiling at an elementary school. Some of the other guys refused to do it. Even the guys who couldn't speak English refused. So the site supervisor made me do it. I thought it was just a minor labor, but it turns out it wasn't dust coming out of the pipe hinges, but asbestos, and I breathed that substance in for a week straight. It turns out the supervisor knew and didn't want to have to call in another contractor to seal off the room and slow the job down. Story 26. I worked at a place that I won't divulge here for legal reasons. It was a 45-minute to an hour drive each way on a crowded interstate for me. I went in at 6 and left at 4 every day, doing the job of 3 people by myself for a few months. Worked with some questionable people, one of whom was charged with money laundering in the last place he worked, and he was unofficially working in a higher position. Fast forward 8 months into my employment and they've suddenly started delaying our paychecks, but they paid us before the legal 7 days or whatever it was to file with the Employment Bureau, so we had no options. We kept being promised on-time pay and they failed. Then they let our health insurance lapse and I was faced with a significant bill for a major ear infection my son had suffered. So in a meeting I asked in a respectable voice and without cursing when we could expect to be paid on time again. The next Friday I was filing unemployment because they laid me off. The only other guy they let go confronted them a few weeks after I'd left for still not being paid on time. To this day, they aren't paying on time and the feds cracked down on them for having that individual work for them, so they opened a new company in another state. I find their ads on Craigslist and flag them so I can hopefully save another innocent person from being mistreated like I was. Worst employer I've ever had. Story 27. I worked as a waiter in a small diner. We used to have about 3 car shows each summer. The first one I worked, I got handed a table of 15. I nailed their drink and food orders without writing anything down at the table and even gave the correct food and drink to everyone the first time. I was on top of that table. When all was said and done, 2 hours later, they paid and left. I saw my tip on the table and noticed a nice, crisp $100 bill. For a kid in high school making $3 an hour plus tips, that's a huge payday. Next thing I know, my boss, the owner, hadn't lifted so much as a finger all day, starts bussing the table for me and tells me to seat the customers coming in. Thinking nothing of it, I did as I was told. An hour later, I asked where my tip was, and my boss replied, "I bust the table, so I get to keep the tip. That's how it works here." I walked over to the register, pulled out my pay up to that point, counted it in front of her, and walked out in the middle of the dinner rush during a special event. Story 28. I don't recall if I was told this before, but I worked at a place fresh out of high school where we built computers in large numbers. The cases were cheap and would cut you while you were mounting stuff in them, refurbished old hardware, anything to save a buck, and it was just an all-around questionable kind of place. So naturally, you get many of those styrofoam inserts. Our dumpster was full, the neighbor's dumpster was full. Boss man tells one of our non-English speaking coworkers to fill up a 5-gallon bucket with gasoline and to push the styrofoam down into the gasoline. This dissolves it and it's fine. I immediately started laughing and pointed out that what they were making, this makes for a very flammable, sticky substance. So yeah, he probably dissolves 100 or so of those inserts into this bucket. Then boss man realizes what we're going to do with this, and they dumped it straight into the drainage port on the curb. Story 29. I was a manager for one of the bigger T-Mobile retailers in the US. It was straight up policy to take whatever employee sold the least in that month and fire them regardless of any circumstances every single month. They officially called this policy, I kid you not, shock and awe. Obviously, we were not allowed to tell any of our employees about said policy, because employees will always work harder knowing they constantly run the risk of getting fired. Great long-term strategy. I was a manager brought in from another company, and my first week had to fire a guy due to shock and awe who had worked there a year but had had a bad month. I told our regional representative that if he wanted that guy to be fired, they should be the ones to do it, not the new week-old manager who barely knew anybody. To which I was told if I didn't want to participate in shock and awe, they would find somebody who would. I ended up working there for 2 months and resigned, telling them that they were the most morally bankrupt group of people I've ever met. I could go on and on about that company's practices, some of which had to be illegal. The company is Alert Cellular out of California, but they are in multiple states. Seriously, don't give these people your money. Go to a corporately owned location for your phone. Story 30. I was really hard up for a job a few years back and applied at some sales gig. The building/office space seemed impressive, so I was pretty sure it wasn't a fly-by-night scam or anything. It was a small operation. I actually interviewed with one of the executives. I found this odd, but again, it wasn't in some crummy strip mall or anything. So once the interview starts wrapping up, I start asking for more information on the product and service being offered. He then begins to lay out in very great detail and smugness how they basically sell coverage to senior citizens, but, and here's where he seems so smug, it's not legitimate insurance, it's just coverage. You're not allowed to call it insurance and they don't actually cover anything, but it gives the clients peace of mind, so that's not too bad, right? He basically laid out how we convince senior citizens they're insured, but in reality, they don't cover hardly anything. While he's explaining this, I look up and see a framed picture of Tom DeLay. Not signed, not with the executive. He just framed a picture of Tom DeLay and hung it up the same way a college kid would hang up a poster of Bob Marley. I couldn't stop thinking about this ethically questionable person calling my grandmother and charging her for services he never provide. I immediately left there and never looked back. I explained to my then wife why I wouldn't take the job, even after struggling and being unemployed for almost a year, and she was totally okay with me declining the offer. Story 31. I worked for a small company, 10 people when I started. I worked hard and eventually got a huge promotion to parts manager for the growing company. The same day I started, a new accountant did too, so I'm handling half the accounting as well with no training whatsoever for anything. Long story short, my manager was making me use all these weird, questionable vendors when my job was supposed to be finding the cheapest vendor. He's watching over my shoulder every minute, making sure I use these certain vendors, getting frustrated when I don't, even if it means a week extra wait for $100 in paint. I get criticized for not having the parts in stock or get criticized for ordering it from the wrong person, so I looked into it. A couple weeks in, I find fraud, stealing from company accounts, petty cash gone missing. I find out the manager is making me use certain vendors because he is getting huge kickbacks for using them, charging customers for options they didn't order and having them wire cash to his own account. The new accountant is also the manager's friend who needed a job, so she's manipulating numbers trying to make it all work. Before I realized it was a manager, I told a few trusted people about what I was finding. Right before going to the owner, who I later found out was in on a lot of it, boom, I was fired and told to leave immediately. He tried deleting all the evidence against him, but I'm not stupid. I saved it all on a hard drive as I was gathering it. Unluckily for them, I had bought one of my dream cars while I worked there, and through car meets and things, I made a few friends, especially with lawyers, and had a case started the next morning, which is still going on. Story 32. Former construction contractor here, well, a laborer/foreman for a contractor. I did kitchen and bath work for a few years. The most questionable behavior I ever saw was a fellow worker's habit of waiting until the homeowners left the house, then sneaking into their daughter's bedroom and interacting inappropriately with personal items. This guy was a law enforcement officer doing contracting for side cash, if that makes you feel any safer. The second bit of questionable behavior was from another coworker who sold illegal substances for his primary income and did the contracting work, which he was good at, to give himself a legitimate job to put on his tax forms. The dude also stole and flipped motorcycles and cars for cash, and on several jobs, he was clearly examining the house and vehicles for potential theft. Story 33. I worked at a restaurant. The dude who owned it was a large, unpleasant-looking man who would stop by once or twice a week to check in on things. The only thing he would do would be to come in, shut himself in the walk-in cooler for a couple of minutes, come out, get a glass of Pepsi, and leave. He was going into the walk-in cooler to eat the potato salad with his hands every time. We would look at the bowl and sure enough see the imprint of where his fingers would have scooped out a couple of handfuls of potato salad. We eventually caught on and would hide the good potato salad when we saw him coming and leave out a bowl of old salad for him. He was highly unsanitary. Story 34. A lady comes in to buy a car. She can't afford the down payment, her credit is poor, and her trade-in is worthless, basically a perfect trifecta for I'm walking home. The sales manager tells the sales guy to take the customer to Best Buy, buy a TV for $100 so he can value it at $1,000. This was done to make the loan look less risky to the lending bank. 1 week later, the dealership calls the lady to come back for a free car wash, which results in the car being taken back because the bank didn't fund the loan, and the lady crying on the couch without a car or the original TV. America. Story 35. When I was in high school, I was a cook at a Chinese restaurant. This was my first real job, and I actually liked it. I was a fry cook, so I made the fried rice, lo mein, sweet and sours, and other simple stuff like that. We didn't get a lot of orders for sweet and sour shrimp, but still regularly made fresh stuff. I don't remember how regularly. One night, we are somewhat busy and actually get an order for some S&S shrimp, so I go to the walk-in cooler to get some to cook up. Apparently, the prep cooks hadn't made any fresh recently as there was barely any left, and over half of it was molded. I told the head cook, and he told me we don't have time to make new stuff and just pick out the good stuff. Here I am in high school, first job, one that I liked. I just did what I was told. That was over 10 years ago, and I still feel bad about it. In my head, I'm hoping that when I put it in the fryer, it ended anything that could have been bad. Story 36. I worked for a startup that the owner wouldn't admit wasn't a good business model. The ship was going down, and they couldn't afford to keep me on salary. I was expecting to be laid off, so when the owner called me into the office, I knew what was coming. He mentioned that I should file for unemployment, which made sense. I had never had to do it before. He then started talking about what I was going to be working on over the next 3 months. I was thoroughly confused. Then it finally became clear. He wanted me to collect unemployment as my paycheck but continue to work the 50 to 60 hours I had been for free. I told him that I was 99% sure that's illegal, and if it wasn't, then it was 100% unethical. He didn't understand. He had over 30 years of business ownership experience and I had none, so he kept telling me that I had it wrong and that it was a perfectly fine thing to do. It took over a week to convince him that that wasn't going to happen. Story 37. I make movie sets, usually on location. After having a licensed electrician take down 14 chandeliers in an old building for a set, I was told to put them back up by the location's owner. I am not an electrician and actually have a fear of electrical work like that. The owner even acknowledged that it was illegal, but since we weren't his people, he wasn't liable. They got me to the top of a 15-foot ladder with a voltmeter to find the connections in the archaic multi-circuit wiring, as I yelled to an intern to throw circuit breakers back on and forth. It only ended when he brought his next clients through the space and made a comment about how we were supposed to be out already but were moving slow. I responded to him with strong language expressing my frustration. About an hour later, I convinced production to pay for an electrician. Story 38. I do bookkeeping for a medium-sized company. Earlier this week, the president had laid off one of our salesmen. He was a 30-year industry veteran, about 5 years shy of retirement. He was a model employee, in early every day, friendly and super professional. Sales numbers come in and he had a bad year, the first bad year he's ever had, and it actually wasn't really that bad. It just wasn't as good as some of the other sales staff. The president decides we spend too much in employee wages, and this poor fellow was a weak link after years of loyal service too. I watched a grown man cry and broke my heart. Everyone was shocked, even the other managers. Here's the totally unacceptable part. On the morning of the layoff, I cut a bonus check to the president equal to twice what that employee made in a year. And a week after, the company paid for the president's shiny new BMW. Morally despicable behavior made me feel sick. Anyways, I've quietly started looking for a new job. Story 39. I worked for a company based at an airport back during the 2008-2009 period when a lot of people were desperately looking for work. If anyone would walk in the door asking for a job, my boss would tell them that nothing was available, but if they volunteered their work for a while, something might open up soon. Of course, nothing opened up for months until I left out of disgust. At one point, he had half of his workforce completely unpaid and off the books with no official training and no compensation. And we were the guys fueling airplanes. Well, if you like these stories, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video.